So, this roundtable is about cyber laws, and the world has progressed a lot, especially since internet was introduced. And this growth has led to an increase of crimes, which in turn can pose an individuals across the world, especially because the people who do commit these crimes hide their identities and it is not the easiest to catch them. Cyber crimes have been recognized by Information Technology Act in India. However, this act does not define what cyber crimes are. And even though this is one of the most important aspects of
Nandini, you've completely stopped for all of us. I don't know.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. My internet is very glitchy. So, the term cyber crimes may not be described in the legislatures, but there are certain laws that exist regarding it, and therefore that's what we're going to discuss in this meeting. So, the first question that I would like to pose to you guys is: does Indian cyber laws provide for data protection and privacy, considering the importance of what one's data holds, especially in a world where behavioral manipulation is a thing? So, who would like to kickstart this discussion? Akshita, would you like to go? Shreya, of course, please go for it.
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like the question also has to be about protection from whom. Data protection laws will, of course, they do talk about corporations being, um, as per I think Section 43A, they do talk about how corporations have to be responsible for sensitive data that they own of other people, of the citizens of a country. But they do not talk about how this data can be used by the government themselves, as we saw with the resurgence of the Pegasus case. uh, the government is accessing personal data for a numerous amount of individuals in this country, and does that award us behavioral protections from them? And I mean, I feel like from owning data and manipulating behaviors, there are a lot of things that can happen with it, but we also need to debate whether or not citizens should be protected to the deserved protection from our own governments under these laws.
That was a great point. Anybody else have anything to add to this? Akshita?
Yeah, my point would be that any piece of legislation is insufficient when we are talking about data protection and privacy, and that we need comprehensive data protection legislation that will actually protect the rights of data subjects, that will prohibit the use of collective data for any purpose other than which it has been. So the IT Act of 2000 is not data or privacy protection legislation per se, and it does not lay any specific data protection or privacy principles. It is more of a general legislation which articulates on a range of themes. And I would also go on to say that it'll be very erroneous to compare our the Indian Information Technology Act 2000 with the provisions of the European Directive on Data Protection or the provisions of the US. And um, further on, I would say that if the new proposed amendments to the IT Act 2000 are adopted, India would still lack a real legal framework for data protection and privacy. And the absence of these laws, data protection laws, is a huge blow to our outsourcing industry in India. Our customers are not as protected as the US and the US customers or the European customers. And the result is that European trade unions have cited data protection as an issue which should be taken into account in many international outsourcing deals. So we should stop the flow of personal data, which in turn affects our outsourcing industry very badly. We should have very solid legal provisions. That's it from my side, Nandini.
All right, Parth, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, of course, what Akshata is saying makes sense. And furthermore, if you look at it in terms of the attitude of the Indian state, in terms of dealing with data privacy and breach and such confidential information, not at the level of the Supreme Court, but at the level of the high courts, as well as the level of at the level of the police, in terms of administration and registration of FIRs, etc. In those contexts, cyber crime as a terminology is generally limited to financial crimes. The idea that, as we discuss later in this roundtable, the High Court's observations regarding cybercrimes are limited to cases of financial fraud, where there's a substantial loss of money. So, Supreme Court apart, think even at the levels of the High Court and at the level of the police, loss of data is still not considered a crime. There is that financial angle that is essential, which is in the current debate around cybercrimes, is a limiting factor, I would say.
Yes, that's actually very true. All right, so that's the discussion of the first question. Now, moving on to the next one. The webs, for instance, the websites of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, the army, as well as the interfaces of two major banks were affected in a cyber attack. Is India equipped to deal with a similar attack on the cyber war front? So, who would like to kickstart this question? Shohan.
So many countries like North, like especially the emerging new wanting to be superpowers like China, Russia, and North Korea have invested heavily in cyber warfare, and which I believe that is a counteractive because their main arc rival, that is United States, they cannot essentially compete with them with in conventional weapon sense, right? But I don't think India has very sufficiently invested in cyber warfare capabilities or even cyber defense capabilities. It heavily depends on its conventional arsenals and the nuclear weapons arsenal, which it had as a deterrence to Chinese and Pakistani nuclear programs. So essentially, with the lack of a real cyber threat, which I guess only for now that is only China. So I don't think India is does even have a proper plan for cyber offensive capabilities. It would obviously develop some cyber defensive capabilities because China is a emerging threat not only to India but now even to United States. So India will recognize that and will develop some defensive capabilities, but I'm not sure of the offensive cyber warfare capabilities of India. That's all from me.
Thank you. Shreya.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sean in the way that we haven't invested, but I feel like in those terms, India is also open to outsourcing this. With in case of cyber, when it comes to cyber offensive techniques, if you think about Pegasus, that was an Israeli software, and that was sold. So, I mean, when it comes down to it, warfare is another commodity that can be sold. So is cyber warfare. It is a commodity that India should be looking into defending, and outsourcing seems to be a better capacity rather than building it. It's at this point in time for India because the kind of investment required for a country like ours for the kind of infrastructure that we require will be humongous. So that's kind of my point.
All right. I think I saw Akshita's hand up earlier, if I'm not wrong. So why don't you add to it?
Yeah, so I would go on to say that India has National Technical Research Organization (NRTO), which provides technical intelligence to internal and external security. Further on, we have CERT, that is Computer Emergency Response Team, for which India notifies concern regarding cyber attacks and analyzes their vulnerability. Then we also have NCSP, that is the National Cybersecurity Policy of 2013, which again aims at protecting public and private infrastructure from cyber attacks. And we are also working with US, as Shohan said, that we are outsourcing and on cybersecurity, right? But then if you look at other facts in the same picture, I would go on to say that no, India is not prepared. The facts are as follows. So we have approximately 10,000 cyber soldiers. But if we look at our just neighbor, China, China is basically prepared for, has around 10 lakh cybersecurity experts. Moving ahead, in October 2016, our country's banks suffered data security breaches, and it was very horrifying to see what was actually going on. And it was basically one of the biggest cyber attacks on India, and unfortunately, we could not stop it. And there are Indians who still respond to fake calls about credit cards and bank account details. It is very common, and this shows that there is a lack of cybersecurity awareness among us. Then we are also importing lots of electronic devices from China, which are definitely susceptible to malware and viruses, and that we have very little control over hardware used by Indian internet users. To conclude, I must also say that we have no proper system to actually assess the nature of cyber threats and respond to them effectively.
I think I'll just start.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you in the sense that we don't have a lot of, I mean, even especially something that irked me, something that brought up a point to my mind was when you talked about how we're importing a lot of hardware from them, and I feel like that is going to be a thing for the future for a long time because China is has a at this point in time has a monopoly over basically has a monopoly over rare earth materials, and India is trying to subvert that in the sense of the new alliance, new trade pact that we have formed with Australia, and that might. But this is an industry that will take time. This is a mining industry. It's going to be, first of all, it's going to be ecological exploitative. That is a side to it as well. But it's going to take time for India to develop any kind of basis for rare earth materials. And the fact of the matter is, China continues to be an enemy per se, and just banning apps is not enough. That seems more like a political subversion rather than an actual security uh, statement. So yeah.
All right. Did Shoham just leave?
He still has the link. He should be able to join again. Might have been an internet thing.
Nandini, maybe you want to continue to the next question till one of us can text them.
All right.
Nandini?
The admitting thing is taking time.
Yeah.
He is lobby, right?
Yeah,
Um, should we move on with the next question? And you can join in the meantime, because this is recording.
I think even her call is dropped.
I think we'll just have to wait. We need both of them here.
Yeah, we'll wait. Maybe we can cut it in post. This time.
Why is Shon unable to join? I don't understand. Nandini's completely left the meeting. Shreya,
Yeah.
do we have an option to stop recording? You want to stop and then we can restart it? Yeah, I think everybody's
The
okay.
back.
Yeah,
We can cut it and break it off into.
yeah, that's not an issue. Mm, Still recording. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. No worries.
No, it's okay. Uh, so does anybody else have anything? Does anybody else have anything to add to that question? No. All right. So moving on. Uh, Now, considering how borderless the nature of cyber law is, should be dealt with, and how is it dealt with currently? So, who would like to talk about this today? Par.
Yeah, sorry, your call dropped for a minute. The question is about the jurisdiction, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So there are two primary issues that come up with jurisdiction in Nandini. Can you mute yourself? I think that's, yeah. There are two primary issues that come up with jurisdiction in the cybercrime space. One is cross national borders, and the second is cross state borders. So, of course, as you can imagine, if cybercrime is committed in a particular state and the effect is in a particular state, there is a dispute regarding which court would have the jurisdiction to deal with it. Second, which is something that is not so obvious, is that within the country, within India, there are a lot of cross-state cybercrimes, where if there's a particular, say, a cyber financial fraud, and one person is based in Bihar and the victim is based in Delhi, which police station has the jurisdiction to register the crime, which court has the jurisdiction to deal with it. Those are two different types of issues that must be dealt with, and both have the separate debates which will go on in this discussion. But I'll give the floor to other people to take this
Yeah.
forward.
There is this. There's also a problem with categorization of what is considered to be a cybercrime. I mean, I remember there's this reading a very famous journalist article called "A Rape in Cyberspace," and this is based on something that is happening in 1992, and this is something that's happening when you only have text. Sexual harassment, can happen and has been happening on cybercrime on cyberspace for a long while. But how do you classify this form of harassment, which has consequences in real life? Do we look at it from? Do we look at this from a censorship perspective? What kind of censorship is required that should be enacted onto the cyberspace, or should it be a more as it is portrayed as a liberal space? But this liberal space is only liberal for a certain type of people. It doesn't cross over to other, say for women, it doesn't end up being a liberal space where they often come up with certain kinds of harassment. For people from lower castes, they face a different kind of harassment. Then there's also problems with accessing it. So this space, as it is portrayed to be a very liberal space, it doesn't end up being the same. So should we look at venues of censorship, and how do we curb those, and how do we curb autocratic intentions when it comes to that idea?
All right. Shohan, would you like to add to that?
Yeah. So, talking internationally, like international state jurisdiction, there lacks any formal document, like even a Security Council resolution, or even any convention that encompasses universal jurisdiction, like universal obligation to all the countries, or even most of the countries, regarding the jurisdiction when it comes to cyber crimes. Like the most broadest, I think, would be the Budapest Convention of 2001, which was essentially for Europe. Like European countries had signed through European Union, about what would happen if there is a cyber crime, like any cyber crime taking place between the countries in European Union. Like there have been instances where countries have sought for a universal convention, but it didn't take place. Like for example, the G7 declaration on the reasonable state behavior of 2017, where they tried to say what a reasonable state should do if there is a cybercrime taking place through international borders. But there is no legal enforceable convention in place. The most we have is the 2001 International Law Commission's report on responsibility of states for internationally wrongful acts. Now, internationally wrongful acts, it is taken to be that cybercrime would be a part of internationally wrongful act, but like they don't have specifically any cybercrime related international wrongful act, right? So I guess that thing can be explored in the future. But like according to what we have right now, like what essentially would a cybercrime like right now would be that if it only constitutes a breach of existing international obligation, then only it would be considered as a cybercrime, and hence the state would have the responsibility to act on it. Only if, like, and since there is a lack of a universal convention, the obligation in the first place doesn't take rise. That's the problem, I guess. Thank you. That's it from me.
Parth, I think you should start.
Yeah, sure. I found your point very interesting about the reading that you're talking about. Interestingly, that reminded me of a lot of my friends who were doing volunteer work during the pandemic, where a lot of women who were volunteering for sharing information, connecting people with oxygen suppliers, all of that, they apparently after that got a lot of harassment texts and calls and unsolicited pictures. It was actually pretty bad considering the humanitarian context in which their personal details were shared. That was quite unfortunate to look at, and it's a very unfortunate incident for our country as a whole. And coming back to Shohan's point, the international law position he put out very well. I would like to add regarding the domestic legal framework in dealing with cross-border cybercrimes issues are twofold. One is within the CRPC, which is the Criminal Procedure Code. There are um, section 188, 178, and 179, which lay out a framework regarding the jurisdictional trial courts in India to try issues or offenses that have an international dimension, I would say. I won't go into the nitty gritties of it, but they lay out a framework that if part of the issue was part of the offense took place across the border and part of it took place in India, certain trial courts would have jurisdictions, certain domestic trial courts would have jurisdiction to try that offense. But secondly, what's comparatively more relevant to the issue of cybercrime is the IT Act of 2000, which Akshata was talking about earlier. Section 75 of the Act describes and states that an offense committed outside the territory of India by any individual, if the commission of the conduct or act constitutes a crime that comprises a computer network, or computer setup, computer system situated in India, the court within whose jurisdiction such system is situated would have jurisdiction to try that offense. So there is a particular prescriptive jurisdiction that is given by section 75, and it's interesting because this system or this computer network doesn't need to be the victim or the system to which the offense is caused. It just needs to be involved in that particular cybercrime transaction. So there the jurisdiction of the local courts is prevalent.
I actually find the jurisdiction in the geographical sense quite interesting because, especially in terms of the Bully by Act, that app. So you had a case where women from all over India were being put up for freaking auction, and you had the place where this app is emerging from. You had the police of this place being negligent. You had had the authorities being negligent in this place, but the fact that the people who were being auctioned off, or the victims of this conspiracy, they had the option of going to the authorities in their own states, and the police from their own states could take action I feel that gives a lot of freedom, in the sense, because these are crossing state boundaries, and the fact, and the it does give options for pursuing, and I feel that that might create a state of ambiguous ambiguity in the future. It might, for sure, and that's not something that law should allow for in some capacity, because, but it does at this point in time where we're talking about so many negotiations. I feel like it's a light and darkness kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And this brings me to the second point I started this discussion jurisdiction with regarding cross state borders when a particular cybercrime is across different states. Um, what you're saying is true, that there is a sense of freedom, but what has also been observed by different courts is a hesitancy by the police administration in recognizing the gravity of cybercrimes and taking appropriate action. So there's a very interesting observation. There is a case, it's called Shiv Kumar and others versus State of Bihar, wherein the Patna High Court had very recently, in 21st February 2022, had explicitly noted that the police stations are not registering FIRs against cybercrimes. Interestingly, it also noted that even when the so under the TRI, that is the under the TRI guidelines, the telecom distributors, the telecom companies are required to register FIRs in case they find any discrepancies in their own networks. So interestingly, the Patna High Court observed that even when telecom companies are filing FIRs within the jurisdictional police stations, the police, the officers in charge are hesitant and they're not registering them. Now, think of it in that context. If an individual is aggrieved, there are certain systemic barriers that they face, which a company does not usually. A telecom company, which is well established in the country. But even they are facing issues. And the High Court themselves have noted it. So, in that context, an individual who is a victim of cybercrime, especially when it does not involve a financial loss, I don't think there is any appropriate remedy at the ground level, or whether the administration will take their loss or their injury seriously. And that is quite a unfortunate picture to paint. There is another point that I can add to this discussion. Interestingly, I don't know if you guys know, but there is a cyber appellate tribunal that was set up by the government. It's called the CYAT, which was established in 2006. And it's been a while, and I couldn't find anything on this interestingly. But I found an article from 2016 which talked about how this tribunal is almost like a joke because since 2011 it has not had a chairperson. The Comptroller Auditor General has noted that it makes an annual expenditure of 30 crores, and yet not a single judicial order had been passed by it in 5 years, from 2011 to 2016. It is, I quote from the Wire, that it would be laughable if it weren't so unfortunate, the condition of the tribunal. And
I feel like laughing at unfortunate incidents in this country has become a coping mechanism, first of all.
yeah, and it is pertinent to note that in the context of the current government, where they are pushing for a more digitalized India, which is a fair goal, which is a fair aspiration of the state. But in that context, they need to strengthen such existing mechanisms first. It's very easy to talk about, oh, we should have a new framework. That is fair, and that is like it's a right direction to go into. But when you have existing bodies like this tribunal, which was set up under the IT Act itself, but yet nobody's heard of it because it doesn't have any, it doesn't do much to correct the system for now. So there needs to be a strengthening of these systems as we go to a more digitized age. Yeah.
I mean, we also need to have wings of the judiciary that are equipped to deal with these crimes. because they are not often carried out by, again, individuals. Going back to it, we need mechanisms against the executory function of the state. We need mechanisms that allow citizens to fight against the legislative and executory bodies of the state at times, and judiciary is the only one who can be an answer to this. So I feel like this needs to be a priority for a nation like ours who is pushing for digitalization so hard, and which is valid because considering the pandemic, considering we realize the worth of the digital, we realize the potential of the digital again and again, but we also should be cognizant of the harms that can come with it. And I feel, again, we need mechanisms for citizens to protect themselves. We need a set of rights. We need a certain set of boundaries that need to be established.
Yes, I'm so sorry about that. My internet has been very glitchy. So one final question before we end this discussion is whether the laws of war and armed conflict apply to the actions that take place within cyber warfare. So, does anybody have any points regarding this? Shohan, please.
Like since we have already talked about the like cyber warfare in the case of how Ukraine is facing that from Russia, and how, like previously about the state behavior in international jurisdiction for this. So it like currently I guess it's a very ambiguous gray zone, because technically like UN Charter and like nearly every international instrument gives a state to retaliate as a right of self-defense. But the question remains is a cyber warfare constitute as a actual act of aggression? Because like in UN Charter, Article 51 says that if a state might exercise its right to self-defense if an armed attack takes place against it. So is the cyber warfare an armed attack? That's the remaining question. And just to quote, ICJ had given an advisory opinion on the legality of use of nuclear weapons. Like even if it's nuclear weapon, they stated in their opinion that a nuclear weapons use is justified under right to self defense, because like right to self defense does not apply to any specific use of force and any specific weapon being employed. So I guess that should imply that cyber warfare, because it would be the weapon that is being used, so it should imply that right to self defense would be a part of cyber warfare would be a part of right to self defense. And if it is a part of right to self defense, then it would be an armed like act of aggression, right? So essentially cyber warfare being conducted on civilian population, especially on critical infrastructure like power grids, water supply, which is a common fact now for like many countries, not to name any country in particular. Um, so that would be a violation of Geneva Convention, international Hague regulations, international humanitarian law, and such that, right? Because you are attacking non-combatants, and which is like the norm is now you cannot, right? International Red Cross regulations, everything about that. So essentially, this it's like we don't have any specific rigid obligating mechanism for states to not conduct those in cyber warfare, because like those who do cyber warfare on critical infrastructure, they argue that no, these are not armed attacks per se, right? So I guess this thing needs to be looked upon, because cyber warfare is the new best um, alternative to conventional forces.
Yes.
There is also the consideration of cyber warfare as a form of protest that's happening in the case of Ukraine and Russia. And a lot of experts are talking about how non aligned individuals are attacking Russia in this case. And there's also been other incidents of cyber warfare as a form of protest. And if you think about the Black Lives Matter and about how individuals were attacking state infrastructure, by that I mean like playing NWA is beeped the police on police radios while protests were going on in Chicago. So, I mean, these are cyber warfare is also a ploy for protesters at times. So considerations around that, around the ethics of cyber warfare's protests, it's also something to be taken in mind, I think.
Right. Coming back to just Shohan's point, although Shreya's point is very interesting, but regarding Shohan's point, I think it'll also be interesting to see the confluence of cyber warfare and conventional warfare. Say, in the context of right to self-defense, if tomorrow a country initiates a cyber attack against another country, and in retaliation, suppose a neighboring countries, the other country orders an invasion, would that be considered within the right of self-defense? Because at the end of the day, if you're attacking essential commodities or essential rights of a particular country, that is an act of aggression. That should be an act of aggression. I'm not saying it is, but within the context, it should be. And yeah, Sean, I'd like to hear your response to that.
Yeah, actually, that is a great point. Like there was an instance, Iran was developing its nuclear weapons program. US conducted Pegasus, and like, they initiated denial of service attacks against the nuclear program system of Iran, and like obviously United States denied that we had no involvement in doing so, but like Iran's first response was that this is an act of war against the state of Iran. Like the question becomes okay, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can anyone say if you can hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you really.
No, but Shohan, your voice
Can you hear me?
broke.
Okay.
Yeah, if you could
Can you
repeat your
repeat your
point.
point? Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, okay. Just to make the last point, I'm just keeping my camera on because otherwise, uh, I guess I wouldn't be able to. So yeah, the concept of proportionality comes in, right? Because even in right to self-defense, there is a proportionality of sorry, there's a principle of proportionality and distinction, right? So, like for example, if someone attacks you, like sends in one warship, would you retaliate with a nuclear weapon? Right. And if that is so, that wouldn't be a right to self defense. It's just an offensive attack. Excuse. So, in that context, like cyber warfare, like what would the proportionality of cyber warfare? Is it cyber warfare, or like can you use conventional forces too? That's a good question, actually.
Yeah, fair enough. Interestingly, that is a longer discussion. But coming back to Shreya's point about using cyber crime as a means of protest, that's a slightly
Not to say
unsettling issue.
allow it.
Hmm.
No, I'm not saying we should allow it because it is harming infrastructure. But it's
Hmm.
even if you think about it from the cross national, transnational point of view, it's happening right now. A lot of hacktivists are attacking Russia's warfare, but
Yeah,
what's happening?
anonymous.
Anonymous does that a lot.
Yeah.
Anonymous is based on this
Hmm.
idea of protesting through cyber warfare. So, I mean,
Hmm.
this is a ploy, and this is again reclaiming certain freedoms, reclaiming certain parts of the cyberspace for public knowledge. And of
Hmm.
course, there are again debates on this idea of reclamation and how these ideas are often again feeding into this idea of the liberal and the idea of free speech. The,
Hmm.
these are of course quantities that are they're of course the fuels that are offered to these protests. There are again debates on the ethical considerations around them, but these are also things that are happening. uh,
Hmm.
I mean, these are also subversions of the cyberspace, because when we think about it, cyber warfare is a power game. It's an extremely powerful game. You have the same imperialist people who are heading the geopolitical scenario also heading this game, but then you're seeing these resurgences through individuals who are claiming and protesting these ownerships of countries like Russia, of countries like US. You have US citizens protesting against the state through its own mechanisms. So it's certainly interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Yeah. I think we've reached the end of the discussion. Um,
Let her confirm once. I mean, we can make a certain.
yes, of course.
If she doesn't join by like 11:05, we can end it
Okay, sure.
sooner.
I was gonna call her, but then I remember that her phone's broken. We can't reach her.
Yeah, let's stop the recording.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for such a good discussion. Unfortunately, our um, master of ceremonies has had a internet glitch, so we'll be ending this for now. Thank you all for watching. Should I stop the recording?
Yes.